Hello everyone and welcome to Tampa Theatre, one of the great spots in our community. I'm Greg Yadley. I'm past chair of the Public Art Committee and a partner in the law firm of Shoemaker, Loop & Kendrick. We're here today thanks to the generosity of the Bailey Family Foundation, who is sponsoring today's symposium. And we're going to do something a little different than maybe you've participated in the past, because the key word is participate. Our artists are going to make some comments and share some images of their work, and then they're going to initiate a discussion about their art and, most importantly, how it fits in the cultural environment, particularly today in the 21st century and here in Tampa and other places where they've been active. Once they get the pump primed, we invite you to participate. There are going to be mics in the aisles, so about halfway into it, you'll get a high sign, or if you just can't wait, walk up to a mic and ask a question, and we'll all learn some things today. So thank you to the artists for participating, and thanks again to the Bailey Family Foundation.
Thank you again, everyone, for coming, and we certainly hope to see you Saturday at 6 o'clock at the Fort Brooke Parking Garage as Lights on Tampa 2009 kicks off. What we'll be doing today, as I mentioned, is first you're going to see some renderings of each of our artists' work. We're going to have a discussion, and hopefully you'll become engaged and enjoy and ask some questions as well. These are our artists that you'll be seeing today. I'm going to ask if they each raise their hand as we go down the list here. Friedrich Forster and Sabine Weissner. They are with Casa Magica. They'll be at the Fort Brooke Parking Garage. Chris Doyle, who's at the Tampa Convention Center. Will Pappenheimer and Chip Jensen. Carlton Ward. He's also going to be in the old Tampa Bay History Center site near the Convention Center. And Marina Zerkow, who will be at the St. Pete Times Forum. What we'll start doing is, again, I'm just going to begin by looking at going through the artist's work, reading a brief statement of their work, and we're going to jump right into the questions. Okay. This is called Revamp Fort Brooke by Casa Magica. It says, at first glance, these dazzling images appear to be glamorous embellishments for a utilitarian structure. With closer examination, one sees that each image is a collage that carries specific references to some part of Tampa's history and identity. Okay. And these projections are 8 stories high, so you'll certainly have to see it to believe it. Next is Chris Doyle at Static City. This is a permanent and temporary installation. You are looking at the rendering for the temporary installation. It's called Static City Tampa, and Static City Tampa is a project about animating a place, in this case, the Tampa Convention Center. Beginning at dusk, pedestrian areas of the city will be bathed in a gentle wash of spinning light. By taking a conventional off-the-shelf object typically used in the disco and recontextualing it in the city, I am attempting to amplify a sense of atmosphere, the mood of expectation, and possibly that is so important to the life of a place and the experience of its people. And possibility, excuse me. Okay. And that's the permanent rendering, which looks just like that. Okay. This is Tampa Public Mood Ring by Pappenheimer and Jensen. Pappenheimer and Jensen's interactive program is hosted by TampaBay.com, where online visitors can engage the program and rate the mood of the news. The lighted ring responds to text, much like the classic mood ring responds to temperature. Gerdau Ameristeel, using recycled steel, built Pappenheimer's design. Pappenheimer says, my current work is generated with an interest in creating overlapping virtual and real-world objects that function through participation and often appear as useful rather than artistically motivated. Okay. And that's similar to the template that you'll be seeing, and Will and Chip can certainly address that more thoroughly. Okay. Next, we have Carlton Ward. Okay. And Carlton Ward is from the Tampa Bay area, and he's using conservation photography. The title of his body of work that he has done is called Tampa Bay, Living Waters, And using conservation photography, the artist recognizes the natural wonder of the original Tampa Bay and the human engagement connected to its living waters. Specific environmental messages complement the images. This installation is a prototype for a developing educational system called the Portals. The Portals will be part of the Riverwalk Cultural Plan, so Carlton's work will also come back in another form, a permanent installation along the Riverwalk. And last but not least by any means is Marina Zerkow. Marina has created an 18-minute loop projection entitled Slurb. There is music also that has been written especially for this by Lim J. Ignacio. Did I say that right? Mm-hmm. The animated carnivalesque tailgate party of Slurb loops and stutters like a vinyl record stuck in a groove. In Slurb, people have been forced to move onto the water where the jellyfish now have dominion. This animation recalls the satirical illustrations of J.J. Granville's Where Animal-Headed Humans Tell Social Narratives and J.G. Ballard's prescient 1962 novel, Drowned World, where inhabitants of a flooded world feel the tug of the sun and the dream of a return to their amniotic past. Okay. So these installations, you will see them all up close and personal on Saturday. Of those, also I should mention, Marinas will come back as a permanent form as well. It will be available on the internet, and it will also be available on City of Tampa Television. It'll be in various loops there. What I would like to do now is to also open up some of the questions to the artists and really get them engaged in a discussion about how some of their work applies to some of the issues that we're going through in Tampa, as is, I think, so many other areas. And one of the things I think a lot of it will have to do with is not only how do we interpret images, but I think it's how do those interpretations get pushed out to the public, and how does the public receive them? And what drives this is the notion that public and private space is fundamentally interconnected on conceptual and experiential levels. If you look at the type of work that we are showing for this Lights On, it is high-tech and low-tech. It's all experiential. And in some levels, there's just different types of engagements with the public, but at the same time, perhaps the public will experience them in very similar ways. I'm not sure if you're following me on that, but what I'm talking about is how a virtual audience, for instance, in Will's and Chip's work, might be very similar to the audience that Chris will have at the convention center. Because where is the individual in this sense? Is that making, how would you guys respond to that? Do you know what I mean by the individual in that sense? I can read.
Sure. I think one of the interesting things, and something Chip and I are working with here by working with websites and web communities in this case, is that there is now a virtual social space which is as live and active as physical space, and sometimes even more active. And we're definitely interested in including that space along with the physical space and seeing how they overlap and how they interact together. Those folks online will be probably as active as the people that walk into the sculpture in our case. Anybody else?
I think an interesting thing is we tried also to make our online interface to the actual sculpture kind of fit and have some metaphors that you might find comfortable or you might find in various online applications, like the use of emoticons to present the mood and the option of having customization. So there is an interaction between the public being able to also be able to engage with the work, not just by viewing it, but also by affecting its presentation. So that thereby affecting the public presentation in the park.
One of the interesting ways that idea overlaps with what I'm up to, I think, is that I play on using some things that are familiar to create something that may not necessarily be as familiar to the public, to people who experience the piece. So for example, in the same way that you make the interface something that's familiar as a way of engaging people or bringing them into the project, I also try to use something that is sort of something that has associations for people, that brings them into the conversation at some level, and then quite possibly, once they experience the piece, then they leave the piece feeling maybe differently about that thing. And in this case, the mirror ball, specifically is something that is actually meant almost to bring people into the piece at one level, and then I'm hoping to send them out of the piece in a different way.
And just to address directly this issue of the public, I definitely don't think there is the public. I think there's a lot of publics, and what happens in a festival like this is that all of these publics have the opportunity to overlap, because a festival amplifies what we do individually and forces people to kind of get outside of their maybe niche preferences for looking at things. So, and I'm sure we all have very different kind of invitational strategies. Mine is very much like pop culture cartoons that may upend your expectation of what those things are. For instance, my work's not very happy, but it's pretty candy. So I think that a festival, as opposed to producing one single project that sort of melts into the landscape rather quickly, is that you have this kind of amplified force at work to bring all these publics into kind of into the same space to look at a diverse group of work.
Which, of course, then it brings to mind the idea that, in fact, a festival like this is actually about creating another kind of community from overlapping communities. And so while part of your guys' piece is that it really is a kind of virtual community, and then there's a real object that brings people into a real space, I think one of the things that Marina was saying is that each of these projects might draw a different constituency, and then they sort of mix themselves up in real space.
I mean, what's exciting is that the public walking by one of the pieces, Marina's projection, for example, would kind of have a pleasant surprise, and they might be interested in finding out where else in Tampa might there be some other kind of installations, and if they're interested in one, it may draw them more broadly, which is nice in the festival context, as you mentioned.
I mean, and the web, of course, is, without our even doing anything, this amazing extension of any real space at this point, because people are going to put Flickr pages up, and you'd search for anything, or you'd see a little bit. One would hope that you would want to experience these pieces that I think, in every case, is designed to be seen in the flesh, in a better form than what you would find online, except perhaps yours, but even there's a kind of a dependency, right, on its fleshly or steely form, right? It never is going to be satisfying to just be on the net with a piece like this, right? Because you need to see the result.
Yeah, in this case, and some of the projects we've done, what's a little bit unique is allowing the public to actually control something large in physical space. That's something, you can be online and you can talk to people, but you can't necessarily, actually affect something out in the real world. That's a little bit different here. I was going to also mention that our project is also inviting particularly an NFL football audience, that kind of fanaticism to participate, which is a little bit unusual, and that's tied to the Super Bowl coming here and so on. So we're experimenting with that in some sense. Another thing that I think is always interesting to mention in projects like this is the idea that one idea that is very interesting in contemporary art here is the idea of a social sculpture, or another word that people use is relational aesthetics. And these things sound kind of sophisticated, but actually it's rather simple, which what it kind of refers to is that we're talking about artwork that engages different group, that comes into being by being in a social space and having different communities and different reactions involved with it. In other words, that it's not self-sufficient, that its aesthetics, its beauty comes out of its interaction.
I'd like to jump in on that, because that's a really good point. And what's been discussed so far is a real interesting kind of difference to what, for instance, Sabine and Friedrich do all the time, because their work in so many cases is very embedded in history and social context, and yet it's also lots of festival experience in terms of how it's presented. I'm wondering how Sabine and Friedrich feel that relates to what's been said so far.
Actually, as we work like collecting a lot of things during we are on a space where we make a project, we ourselves did not always follow one concept. It's very much also creative during work, you know.
So I mean, perhaps I could comment a bit about the difference in approach to yours. That in many festivals, there are works, there are interactive works, and we are also talking to colleagues who are doing these, and it's a very challenging thing because you never know what people are going to do on it. And you don't know whether you want to interfere and control or not. Actually, in Lyon, the festival, there was a big push to do something interactive, and we have been invited, and we said, no, we will do exactly the other way around. We will do an automized production that's completely ready, and it will run like this. And it's actually, most times I say we are pushing people into, you would say, at the first glance you would say into the passive role. But I don't think that it's really a passive role. It's just that I say, okay, please do me the favor and stand and have a look at it. And please come back and take your time. And you perhaps won't find everything at the first glance. People are so much used to look at advertising. And advertising philosophy is, okay, 1 second looking, and then they need to know and understand everything. I said, you may do like that, but it's not necessary with us. If you look only 1 second, you see something, you get a feeling perhaps. If you look another one, if you do another one, our idea is to give them, to find them more and more in a thing, and to meditate about it. And so I think, for us, we think it's okay to give people something that is completed and to make them meditate and look at it, like it's the old way of taking in art. I won't object to doing interactives, but I think for me it's okay, and just to say, okay, I dare to do it like that, still.
Well, I think it's a little the whole idea of interactive has been discussed a lot, and it's actually a little misleading at times because, and one point I'd make, for example, about just an interpretation of what you're doing. When you project onto the side of a building a still image or a video image, you are changing that building possibly forever, but certainly during the time that it's projecting. And so that kind of juxtaposition of the building and the image and the history and the subjects and so on, the person who sees that has to interact with it in their brain. Okay?
That's for sure.
So we might have to code interactivity into our work, but that's why I don't actually see a divide, if you follow what I mean, in that sense. But anyway.
No, it's not. I don't think divided. I think it's just several ways, and your way is actually you invite people to participate in the results directly with these.
As does Chris. Yeah, certainly.
I think some projects more than others, but I do think the idea of, for me, is that there's this effort to communicate. This is how I start, is that I'm actually trying to communicate with people who will come and experience this work. So I set something in motion, which is basically my half of the conversation. What I don't have any control over is the way people respond. So they're part of the conversation, I never know what it's going to be. So I guess the way that I see it, I think these are all different degrees of engagement. Like it's just, there are different degrees of how much you are saying in your half of the conversation. And sometimes you give a little bit more and there's a little bit more of structure. In this particular piece, it's really kind of a little bit different from what I usually do because I often make video images and project them. And in this particular case, I dropped out the image, and I wanted to sort of experiment with the idea of just creating the atmosphere of a place rather than an image of a place. And so what that does, I think in the same way that you're talking about it, is that it changes the way people view that space. And when that piece is gone, the parts that are gone, when you go back to that space, you won't think of it in the same way.
Definitely, there's a very different requirement for a frame around work that requires participation, prescribed participation, versus something that can be experienced by an assembly of people. Like, you guys need a frame. If you didn't have a frame, you would have no audience to go online and actually make this ring happen, right?
Right.
So, I mean, that's the kind of the biggest problem with, I've taught some site-specific classes for interaction design students, and that is really the biggest problem. How do you invite them in? How much latitude do you give them? What are you asking them to do? Which is really different from, in this case, a video wall.
Right, something where it's experienced by the past.
In a lot of ways, it's kind of like a collaboration, because if, when you look at the sculpture and there's no one there, for example, online, you can interact with it and you have that pleasant moment. Or when you're sitting and watching the sculpture in the park, the question is, of course, the lighting that happens. There's a collaboration with the other person, right, or someone who is viewing it online. So a lot of interactive pieces do enjoy a great benefit from having a swell of interaction in some ways, and in other ways it becomes just still and waiting for this public to interact with it.
I want to go back to something that Chris had mentioned, and actually I hope you could build on that. You mentioned that putting the work out there basically is your part of the conversation. So I want to go to what's the other part of the conversation, in the sense if it's the public response or engagement to it. And you're absolutely right, and that's one reason I find art in the public realm so fascinating and wonderfully messy, is that there are some real uncontrollable factors involved. And it's interesting to know how do you, and I would like to hear all of your kind of suggestions and responses, that how do you want your work interpreted? I mean, you can't control that obviously in the public realm, but how, what are your thoughts on what the public thinks, and they bring in, they walk away with something completely different from what you would like to have them think about?
I have some thoughts on that, as well as, and I also want to come back to just the general concept of art in a public space, because unlike what I'm hearing from everyone else on this panel, I have done very little with my art in a public space. So in that sense, the conversation has been more predictable or more defined. It's my photographs have been used editorially in magazines throughout the world, in newspapers and in books, but oftentimes you're reaching to a very specific group of people through those magazines, and for better or worse. And in my particular motivation as a conservationist, I'm wanting to inspire appreciation of certain cultural or natural resources. The people reading Audubon magazine or National Geographic magazine are likely to already share those appreciations. So the opportunity to bring this work into a public space, newspapers do it to some extent because they kind of reach out to all the different interest groups, but to be able to bring the work into a public space, not just the walls of a gallery with limited hours during a limited time of day that's not accessible to a lot of people, it's a neat thing. And the idea that anyone and everyone might have an opportunity to see this throughout the course of the month that it's being displayed it resonates to me that the public space is where art needs to be, particularly if there's a social change philosophy behind it. So that's kind of a long introduction to coming back to Robin's question, but in my work, photographing the natural and sometimes overlooked, unseen natural qualities of Tampa Bay, I know what my part of the conversation is, and I'm actually hoping I don't want the other part of the conversation to be so open-ended. I want certain take-home messages to go with this art.
You're looking for a really specific response. Or you're
I am.
hoping for specific?
I'm hoping for specific responses. I want people who stand by and take in the 10 minutes of the loop of photographs and text to walk away knowing that this is the largest open water estuary in the state of Florida, or that we have 4 major rivers that feed it, and perhaps be able to name a few of those, and to know some of these other qualities beyond the fact that we're hosting the Super Bowl this year.
It's interesting to me because I think that kind of brings up the question of how much of an agenda we have all as artists, and how that agenda manifests itself, and how much of the agenda is over. And in your case, I think, Carlton, you have a very clear agenda and it's clearly stated. And so there's this hope that the other side of the conversation will be something in particular. And I think it's not, I think that's an interesting thing, because for me, I feel like I don't always have, I sometimes do that, I feel like, but I think I don't always have an idea of what I'm looking for from people as much as I am looking for a kind of behavioral change. And so what I mean by that is, in the agenda of this piece is about creating a pedestrian experience. And that's actually part of my agenda, which is, from an urban point of view, trying to activate a city or amplify the qualities of a city so that people come back to it, perhaps, or spend more time in it, or take more time with it, and be concerned about the way they live together in a place, in a physical place. And I think the question about that half of the conversation that you put out, that you sort of set things in motion, and in some cases you hope for a particular response, and in other cases you just hope for a change in behavior or some activity that shows a sign that there is activity out there, and that there is that other half of the conversation coming back at you. I mean, it's interesting if you're a photographer, because you don't always get public feedback. Although I'm sure the web has changed that into a certain degree, because people do communicate with you based on your images now in a way that if the web didn't exist, they never would. But this is a chance, actually, you put photographs out in the public realm, and suddenly you might get much more concrete feedback than you ever have when you just send it out into magazines.
One of the things in terms of and getting a reaction, a number of the projects that I've ended up doing, and Chip has been in many of them, often do involve a rather significant public reaction. Often, if it's even, it may be simply online. And you can sort of gauge that by putting things on your website and measure how many people come to it. But I think one of the interesting things that we're working with here too is the idea is, can you get art actually into an institution, if you will, into a whole way of acting out there or living out there, that's already there. It's already ready-made for you. And in this case, because seems that we've managed to get a kind of response from very NFL football-centered folks saying, yes, we like this, we want to include this and talk and broadcast it and so on, as well as TampaBay.com, which is a newspaper. Why should they put our link on their newspaper? So one of the challenges is, and one thing we've tried in this project, is to see if and those are institutional spaces, if you will. Do you know what I mean? They're spaces created by a group of people that are already there, and they would function without us even being there. And can we try and see if we could create a project that they would actually incorporate into their sites?
Will?
That's one thing we're trying to do here, and see what happens. We don't know.
That's to bridge off of that. How do you stop someone from, what's the difference between getting them interested and then having someone change the meaning of your artwork by turning it into something that that was not your intent?
That's a particular challenge we're going to encounter here. That's a little bit of a new challenge, but actually I've had that before. I recently did a project with an online drug, and the project, so it was a virtual drug, and it ended up being kind of broadcast worldwide, and all of a sudden I got people and news people talking to me about the fact that I was advocating putting drugs out there to the real world. It wasn't even a response to the artwork. It was, and so then it's being interpreted in a way that I didn't even plan.
Yeah.
And to me, I must say that there's an exciting side to that. In this case, there's some things I can't control. I've tried to be a little controlling, but
I would think it would be very interesting. I mean, when your work becomes so popular and so embraced, or identified with either a corporation, a cause, anything along those lines, which absolutely is not of your intent, I would assume that that happens more frequently than we think. I would be curious to know what an artist would or could do about that when your work is taking on a meaning out there in the public realm that you really object to.
it's a great question. I don't know if Chris has run into that. Have you?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that happens is that you set things in motion. You just set it in motion, and you want response. And sometimes you can't. The response is completely unexpected, and sometimes that response might be political. Sometimes it might be corporate. But there's some kind of response that you don't expect. And my feeling about what that is when that happens is that you actually have done your job in provoking some response, and that there is this action that happens as a result of the thing that you set in motion. Then maybe you're not so happy with it. So what I tend to do is make another project, so that the next project takes that experience and absorbs it and internalizes it and lashes out against it, usually, or corrects it, or tries to adjust my own kind of way of working, so that it basically it feeds the next project. But I think in a certain way, the largeness or smallness or rage or fury or loving embrace, you just it comes as a result of us putting ourselves out there and provoking and kind of giving it a little prod.
But yeah, there's something in it for us too. It's enormously instructive to get feedback and not prescribe what you want out of that. I mean, in all respect, Carlton, in a sense, you were producing a kind of a documentary, but there's definitely especially if you're going to have text on your pieces, it's a message-driven project. In many cases, I mean, I don't want to produce necessarily a message. I want people to think about environmental issues through this idea of that there's some pleasure in taking responsibility, that not it's fun to face the apocalypse, but that there's an inevitable need to sort of deal with things, and how, like, there are a lot of different strategies to get people to deal with things. And it's really instructive when people respond negatively. It's unpleasant, but I think it's very instructive. And it's true. I think our work isn't just a project, right? Our work is hopefully a bunch of projects or a lifetime.
Yeah, it's a string of experiences. I mean, I think that it puts us in a position to engage our own communities, and that's what we do, right? Even if we're taking photographs that we want to express a particular distinct, specific point of view, or whether we're making something enigmatic that refers to history, we're actually attempting to engage the community in some way. And like I said, there's so little control of what comes back to you. And what's really difficult and challenging and fun about it is to keep that conversation going. And I think that when you get that feedback, whatever it is, when you go off to make the next contribution or the next statement in your part of the conversation, the next project or whatever, you've basically listened. You've had the experience of engaging with people, and you've listened to them, and you've said, okay, now I'm going to talk back. And I think at least that's how I think of it.
I'm having some thoughts related to this, and it seems to be a continuum of control or a continuum of context on which you surround your art. In my case, as a journalist, I might be on the more controlled side of the spectrum because I feel compelled to put captions with images or describe the context. Like, for instance, I want people who go by this body of work to know that these photographs are Tampa Bay itself. It's not beautiful mangroves in the Caribbean. It's not wildlife in some exotic place. This is right here. And then for the environmental messaging, I want there to be a sense of, I mean, through the art itself should inspire and tell the story, but I don't necessarily want someone to see an aerial view of the mouth of the Little Manatee River and say that's a perfect place to put in a multi-use development. And if the work goes uncontextualized, people still might say that. That's just...
Sometimes you also.
Oh, wait.
What?
I was just going to say, the word control is interesting in this particular context because I think it also is a word that gets used in the context of scientific experiment. And the reason I think that's interesting is because I think of a project as an experiment in the sense that I have a hypothesis that I'm testing. I basically throw something out there and hope that or maybe not hope, or maybe I have no idea what the response is, or maybe I have some idea of what the response is. But basically, the degree of there is a different kind of notion from the idea of actually making a documentary than there is from the idea of actually having an idea and experimenting with it and seeing what happens, and then actually making the next project based on the results of that experiment. And I don't think that it has anything to do with, it's just a different way of making work.
But also, I want to say that I've been thinking a lot about this idea of the frame or context or giving context for the work. But what I've discovered in the last couple of years is, in a sense, the mysteries of having artwork in the public realm that has no branding on it is in itself such a contextual statement. You never see things that aren't branded. And that alone has provoked people to wonder, what is this? Even if they don't have necessarily some kind of an inroad to it, that is so rare, this idea. I was kidding around with the public art commissioner 2 weeks ago going, yeah, 1% for art, yeah, but what about 1% of time? What if we could have 1% of time in the public realm, of unbranded time, to say things, to be responsible, pleasurable, playful, that doesn't have a prescribed destination. I know I keep using the word prescribed because there is something about making art that's fantastically open, and I don't want to lose that.
Yeah. I think sometimes branding actually is a comfort food for the general public, and sometimes, when you experience something that's unbranded in our visual culture right now, maybe that's kind of uncomfortable for the public, which is great.
Because they don't know where to put it.
Right, and they don't know what is this thing that they're seeing right now and who's sponsoring it and whatnot. So it's healthy, I think, to present unbranded work, and there should be more of it.
I wonder if you could even generalize that the more prescription, maybe the less pervasive it might be. I mean, there's certain limitation to contextualizing to where something that's more animatic or more just put out there without context might, I don't know if there's any validity behind these thoughts, but might go further, might reach public consciousness at a deeper, more penetrating level than something that fits, oh, I saw that on Discovery Channel.
But that's why a lot of viral work was really great till you started to become suspicious. Who put this out? Was it Coke? Because a lot of early viral, internet distributed pieces that were done, like the stupid dancing baby or whatever it was. No offense if somebody here made that, but in a way that was really exciting to people because they didn't know where it came from, and it was something pure, and it was really pervasive. And then a lot of marketing companies started to make things like that, and then now it's filled with suspicion.
I've had the experience many times where people have asked me what for what ad was I making as I'm making these pieces out in the world. If they're down the street, participatory pieces, they're like, oh, is this a Gap ad? What is this going to be for? I'll be part of it, and I don't care, but I would like to know. And it's so much more difficult question to explain to people that you're just putting them on the side of a building, or that you're doing this thing and they don't have a frame for it. So the comfort of branding absolutely makes sense. But getting back to that issue, Carl, whether you might, operate at a different level of people's consciousness, depending on the way you make this work. I think in a lot of ways, I hope for or rely on getting at people, bringing them in at one level and actually hoping to infiltrate consciousness at another level. And I never have a real sense of assessment with that. I don't know how it works, but I do think as a strategy, it's something I'm interested in and try to do.
Some of the, an interesting idea here is the idea of shift, however large or small it is in an artwork. In other words, that a public artwork or an artwork appears at one level to be one thing, and yet it doesn't quite fit all the things that it purports to be. And so it creates a kind of shift, which then causes you to reassess what the image is or the place is or so on. And that's one of the ways you can try, if you will, to resist branding and so on. And in fact, some people use the whole concept of branding, a group like, let's say, the Yes Men, to actually, and then cause a shift within the branding process and within the public process. It's a very, very difficult thing to do. I might just say that the project that we're doing here has a side to it where people are definitely trying to brand it, so you're going to see that happen here. We've worked with that in the best way we can, but we are going to hope that the object in the artwork as a whole doesn't quite fit the branding that is being applied to it and so on. So that's another kind of strategy. Another thing you sometimes can do if people are trying to portray your work in a certain way is that if you have the opportunity to speak to it, you can sometimes refocus people in a different direction and say, okay, I know you're trying to see it in this way, but this is what we actually had in mind. And
yeah, if there's anywhere where in public you as an artist have the opportunity to have secondary material, that's really important to me. In a way, the cartoons that I make are markers for research and for thinking through problems. And so I wouldn't want to put that work on the first level. I want the first level to be what you think of what you see, but the second level is very close to the first. It's really, really important to me what went into that narrative, what that narrative actually is about, are real things, real problems, or real issues in the world. And so it's great if, when you make work in the public, if your name and some kind of a URL or something is on there where people can get secondary, tertiary information about what I'm doing is terribly important to me.
I have one quick question that I'm going to interject, and then I'm going to open it up, and hopefully the audience has got some questions as well. And one of the things in hearing you all discuss the various issues in the public realm comes back to one of the things that as administrators we deal with a lot, and that's getting the funding to make these projects possible, obviously. And I would be curious if you run into the agencies that you have worked with in the past, how much freedom you are allowed to have and how that compares with some of the things that you've experienced here.
This is by far the best public art program I've ever worked with.
Yeah, fishing for a compliment, thank you.
And the only, but by far the best.
No, it's been great. I had some concerns that there was politically, it's one thing to describe a piece in text and another thing to make something, and I think I was really scared that this was going to be too close to Katrina for a lot of people's comfort. And you don't see it so much in the stills, but there's fairly some horrifying moments in the piece that I feel like very supported by the City of Tampa vis-a-vis you guys and by the people whom I presented my first work, which is far more inappropriate for the public than something like this, to the whole kind of public art board, that there's an openness that was really, really encouraging and really fantastic.
Yeah, you guys don't chime in. I'll chime in that our project has definitely been very challenging to pull off because there's so many different people involved in it, each with requirements for their or wishes for their part of the project. And Lights on Tampa, Robin and Melissa have stood through that process and endured all of the storms involved in it, which is really critical if you get yourself into things that are hard to do. You need people that are advocating and that are willing to continue the battle, especially if you're hundreds of miles away.
I want to talk a little bit about just how complex these things are to put together, because as you all know, it's always an amalgamation of funding from various sources. And I think this particular organization has been great with managing to put together all kinds of funding from different sources, which I think is really amazing. But I just think it really needs to be said in terms of a city like Tampa or any city, just how important it is that city invests in projects like this. Because I think that it's incredibly important to look to the future and to say, we want people to feel like Tampa is a great place to live. And one of the reasons that people decide to live somewhere is that there are things to do, interesting things to do, interesting things to see, and that the city is engaged at a really high level in this kind of dialogue with people. And I was in Melbourne a couple of months ago, and I remember I overheard people talking about how much they love Melbourne because every weekend there's something really interesting going on in the city that someone is behind. And when people talk about, especially during tough economic times, how we really need to stop funding things and just shut down and hunker down, I just can't stop it. It just makes me remember the importance that people actually invest in the future of their city and in the quality of life of that city, because we all kind of live together in this place. And it just seems so important to kind of continue to fund a kind of provocative and interesting dialogue at that level. And I think programs like Lights on Tampa are so much that kind of investment in the future. Because, my parents are from Scranton, Pennsylvania, which is a city that, when I grew up and lived there for part of my early childhood, was quite boarded up. And I can't help but think that what we don't want is to have a city that's basically evacuated because there's nothing interesting to do there.
Very good, very good. Yes.
Oh yeah, just on that note, one more thought was that, Chris and I both went through this kind of boot camp of thinking about art and culture versus artists, and teaching artists how to sort of have value for themselves outside of the ghetto mentality, which a lot of artists have. And the statistics, the Tremaine Foundation dug up these statistics that everybody loves arts and culture. It brings up neighborhoods, it makes real estate more expensive, it brings people in, it brings tourism, and then a lot of times they just don't have that same relationship to artists who sort of started that. And so I think that's, and I don't mean this defensively at all, I just think that's sort of an important thing to keep in mind, to sort of echo what you were saying, Chris.
Yeah, and there's certainly, this isn't meant to be an endless laudatory diatribe, but it is a little bit. I think that this program is part of a number of programs that are here in Tampa in the art world that actually really puts it on the map and on the art map. And that might sound like it's meaningless. Why would we want to be on the art map? But there's a huge amount of both cultural and dollar value. You know, this is a silly statistic, but apparently up until the recent stock market crash, if you invested in art, certainly in the area of New York City, you made about 10 times as much money on that as stocks, even when the stocks were going up the heights. So people care about the arts, and they care about it actually with dollars. But that says nothing about, as we say, the cultural value that attracts people to go to a place and maybe come and travel here in the future if you keep a program like this going, to travel from anywhere and everywhere to come see this. You know.
I keep coming back to context, it seems, but one thing I appreciate about what the City of Tampa program is doing is in several of these projects, they're having life beyond the end of January. And it makes me feel good about all the work that goes into producing this body of work, to know that it's going to go on to be incorporated into the portals, which will be educational elements along the Riverwalk for years to come. So it's well placed and well conceived in many different ways.
Well, thank you very much, and I'd like to also open it up to the audience. If anybody has questions, please come forward. There's a microphone right there.
Hello.